If Casino Royale is Empire Strikes Back and Skyfall is Revenge of the Sith, SPECTRE is more like the Phantom Menace riding on the past glory of Return of the Jedi. As some of you may know, before 8th grade my parents were too cheap to pay for cable. As a result, I was deprived of all things children my age got to enjoy growing up. I lived the childhood without Looney Tunes. Just let that sink in for a little bit. But it wasn't as bad as you may think, because to compensate for not having cable, my parents brought home a lot of old VHS tape of movies from garage sales. I had the entire Star Wars original trilogy on tape and I watched the shiznit out of them. I still have them. Hey, they don't make them like these anymore, so someday they will be worth a fortune. You just wait. Also among my old collection of tapes were the James Bond movies. I'm talking about Goldfingers, You Only Live Twice, The Man with Golden Gun, you know, the Sean Connery and Roger Moore 007 features from the 60s and 70s. So naturally, as I became some of an expert at garage sale shopping, I began to consciously collect the old James Bond VHS tapes. By the time my parents finally gave in and called Time Warners because, you know, I had to watch High School Musical, all the cool kids at school was going to be talking about it and I couldn't get left out by the cool kids. I have managed to collect all but 2 of the James Bond movies released up until then. Looking back, I cannot thank my parents enough for robbing me of a childhood with Looney Tunes, because I wouldn't have become the die-hard Bond nerd if they didn't. So these movies hold a pretty special place in my heart. So of course I was super excited for the release of the 24th entry of the series, SPECTRE. Now, when they announced SPECTRE as the title for this film, I experienced a moment of nerdgasm. The name itself just triggered so many memories of my 12-year-old self watching my man Sean Connery battling the bald guy with a white Persian cat. I couldn't believe that after all these years, the iconic organizations that kicked off the Bond franchise is making a comeback. And then they announced that the director of Skyfall was returning as well. By that point, I was sold. You know, they can take my money. Now, Skyfall has never been my favorite Bond movie despite the praises it has garnered. I liked it as a movie that combines the elements of classic Bond to the grittiness of Daniel Craig's tough guy Bond. Casino Royale is still my favorite Craig film, but Skyfall for me solidified him as the man with a license to kill. And it was the first Craig movie that truly felt like a Bond film to me. Back in March, they released the first trailer for SPECTRE. It looked fantastic. I was beyond ecstatic. And then I saw the movie. If Casino Royale is Empire Strikes Back and Skyfall is Revenge of the Sith, SPECTRE is more like the Phantom Menace riding on the past glory of Return of the Jedi. I say this because SPECTRE, much like Skyfall, likes to play homage to classic Bond. A little too much. Almost every single scene has some sort of throwback to the older Bonds. The director Sam Mendes went into laborious effort to make sure that the film was as neatly crafted as possible. In fact, I'm going to say this, the visual of this film surpasses that of Skyfall thanks to it being beautifully shot by the 35mm film camera. The entire movie is in a saturated honey hue that reminded me of those European art house movies from the 70s. This is a gorgeous movie to look at. But we don't look at a movie, we watch it. An empty shell is still an empty shell no matter how pretty its pattern is. This is a classic example of style over substance. The director was so engrossed in perfecting the camera angles and the color coding that he forgot that he was making a movie too. What worked with Casino Royale and Skyfall is that although they're very different movies, the little moments in each of these films ultimately work together to build towards a satisfying conclusion that ties the movie together. As a result, they felt very organic. They each offered eye-catching actions while telling a captivating story. There were no stories in SPECTRE. There were scenes, and they were stitched together awkwardly to lead to a final confrontation that felt more Batman and Robin than The Dark Knight. There was no depth, no character development, and very little meat to support a film with such an ambitious title. It felt tired and weary, almost as if the director was fulfilling an obligation rather than having fun with the movie-making process. The characters all feel like stereotypes that only exist to serve their perfunctory purposes, and the slow pacing only added to the drowsiness of the story. The 2-hour-plus movie ultimately felt like a pile of nothing. The movie is a continuation of the events in Skyfall, and a rehash of the same formula used in Skyfall, but in a much more convoluted way. The trailer seemed to suggest that this was going to be yet another personal and gritty tale for Bond. But the finished product has more classic Bond elements than in any of the previous Craig films. From the get-go, it felt like the movie didn't know which direction it wanted it to go. The inconsistency of the tone resulted in a movie that was inconsistent. But I can live with that as long as it has an interesting and compelling villain. The villain in this movie might as well be Dr. Evil. I was extremely disappointed in the performance of Christoph Waltz. For those of us Bond fans, yes, he plays exactly who you think he is. With such a classic character, he really could have gone the extra mile and really made a character his own, much like Javier Bardem did in Skyfall. Instead, it was pretty much a phoned-in performance. Christoph Waltz could have been playing Hans Landa from Inglourious Basterds for all I care because he played Blofeld the exact same way. They had to do nothing else but the shallowness of the story. Plus, the character had a terrible reason for wanting to destroy Bond's life. I won't spoil it here, but it was childish. He was a childish character. In fact, this laziness of character writing can be said with a lot of other characters. Take Léa Seydoux, who played the Bond girl, Dr. Madeleine Swan. She was as unmemorable as Honey Goodnight from The Man with the Golden Gun. Which, I guess this wasn't her fault because she wasn't really given a lot to work with to begin with. Her romance with Bond was as forced as the love story between Hayden Christensen and Natalie Portman in the prequel trilogy. This is actually very sad because I could tell that the producers were trying hard to make Madeleine Swan a Vesper Lynd 2.0. So much so that they even put her and Bond in a scene at a diner on a train similar to the one that Bond and Vesper had in Casino Royale. But when you're shooting on an unpolished rough draft, which I assume this movie was shot under given the final quality of the film, it'll take more than gimmicks like this to pull off a well-told romance. With everything else going on in the story, I'm not sure if it even needed a love story to begin with. After all, James Bond is not one to fall in love with every girl he meets. He'd be facing a lot of parental lawsuits if he is. Similarly, Monica Bellucci was completely wasted in this movie. I kept waiting for her to come back after that one brief scene she had with Craig. I even went as far as naively assumed that she was going to be revealed as the ultimate villain. But no, she came and left Bryan Cranston in Godzilla style and was never seen and heard again for the rest of the film. Why? Why cast someone like Monica Bellucci when you're just going to have her play a character as forgettable as a sack of potatoes? This leads us to the pacing of the story. Let me just say this. Take away 80% of the establishing shots and the silences produced by characters not saying or doing anything. This movie could have been a half an hour shorter. Now, Sam Mendes is a good director and Lee Smith is a terrific editor. But a Bond film is not an art film. I know that the movie making standards has risen significantly since the Sean Connery days, but people don't buy a ticket to see a Bond movie and expect to see Out of Africa. They want to see some well-choreographed action that evenly paced the storyline. Spectre failed to deliver on both counts. There were moments throughout the movie when the pacings were excruciatingly slow. And worse yet, they rarely advanced the story plot in any way. The sequence that introduced Christoph Waltz's character must have been an unedited cut because nothing happened in that 10-minute duration. There was no background music in that scene, as the director was clearly trying to convey a sense of dread and uneasiness by muting all the sound. But the finished product was the opposite of nail-biting, and the subsequent car chase was more of a sheepish yawn than an intense thrill ride. There was no sense of tension and very little urgency, so naturally the audience couldn't get into the scene if there's nothing at stake. In fact, throughout the film, there was never a moment when you were worried about any of the characters' safety. It's like watching a video game playthrough. There was no real investment from the viewers, so after a while you couldn't help but get bored. The action in this movie was decent, though mostly irrelevant to the storyline, which was another thing that Casino Royale did so well. The action sequences in Casino Royale were incorporated into the story. They didn't just exist because the movie needed some car crashes or stairway fistfights. They were there to move the plot along. The action scenes in Spectres were hardly justified. They were thrown in because they were obligated for Bond film. They had no real value to them other than the fact that without them, Spectre would have been a 2-hour movie of people talking, plus endless montages of establishing shots. So without that tension building into the action, I quickly lost my patience and just stopped caring. I never stopped caring in Casino Royale or Skyfall. The one thing I did like about this movie was the music. Thomas Newman proved once again that he can make even the blandest action movie bearable with his Spectre score. I actually looked up the Spectre soundtrack on YouTube after seeing this movie because as pointless as the action sequences were, the music was the one thing that stood out. Props to you, Mr. Newman. Too bad you couldn't save the rest of the film from its own mediocrity. And the less that is said about Sam Smith's theme song, the better. I understand that not everyone can be Shirley Bassey or Adele, but Writings on the Wall is as uninspired and bland as the rest of the movie. Overall, this was a disappointing Bond film, a movie that adds very little to the canon. I know I'm very harsh about this film, but you have to understand that this is my inner Bond geek mending his broken heart. I mean, I had such high hopes for this movie, especially after the triumph of Skyfall. And this film was like a punch in the stomach, followed by 2 more punches. It was well crafted and the visual was well polished. But underneath all that is a film as hollow as the fortune cookie. Okay, yeah, that was a weird comparison. Craig mentioned that this may be his last Bond film. And if that's the case, well, that's just unfortunate. Because he had so much promise when he started his stint as James Bond 10 years ago. And as a Bond nerd, I don't want Spectre to be the movie that people remember him by. More importantly, he deserves to go out on a high. And Spectre is not that high. Eon needs to get their shit together and find that high. If it comes to it, maybe even revamp the series the way they did with Casino Royale. Recently, I started watching Daredevil and Jessica Jones, 2 web-based shows produced by Netflix, and they have better storylines and actions than Spectre. That is a huge red flag that Eon should not ignore. Also, when one of this year's best reviewed movies is about a teenage kid out-bonding Bond by parodying Bond with the help of Nick Fury, you know your franchise needs a serious reality check before it runs out of relevancy. So in the end, I will give Spectre a 6.3 out of 10. Let me know in the comment below if you enjoyed this video. This is Kev Kev, signing out.